Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are using the Johnson edition. We turned out a poem 532. I tried to think a lonelier thing. In many ways, we're back to poem 405. You guys remember when we played this game? It might be lonelier without the loneliness. I'm so accustomed to my fate, perhaps the other piece would interrupt the dark and crowd the little room, too scant by cubits to contain the sacrament of him. I'm not used to hope. It might intrude upon its sweet parade, blaspheme the place ordained to suffering. It might be easier to fail with land in sight than gain my blue peninsula to perish of delight. And you guys remember when we did 449? I died for beauty, but was scarce adjusted in the tomb, when one who died for truth was lain in an adjoining room. He questioned softly why I failed. For beauty, I replied, and I for truth. Themself are one, we brethren are, he said. And so as kinsmen met a night, we talked between the rooms until the moss had reached our lips and covered up our names. Now, our assumption is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hoping that you worked through our set of introductory comments where we talked about Emily as recluse, Emily as, some have argued, agoraphobic, Emily as the individual who stays often away from society and therefore has to engage loneliness directly. Of course, there is a distinction often students will make and readers of these poems will make between being alone and being lonely. I've had a student once who said, I never feel more lonely than when I am in this building with all of those people around me. So loneliness doesn't have to do with being alone. Now, I'm hopeful that you've as well been working with our previous 531 offerings. We just finished with 531, We Dream It Is Good. Now, if you have done that, then you'll be able to place, as we just given you two other readings that we've already studied, be able to place this poem within the context of those poems. Now, Emily loves to play around with what we will call that inner duality. In other words, there's the mind that is thinking, and then there's some capacity for us to be aware or witness the thoughts of the mind. And in poems 642, 670, and 1323, Emily will play again and again with this inner duality game. In some ways, this is another theodicy. You'll remember, this is the fifth of our big five in room 303. Epistemology, what you can know, ontology, who you are, psychology, the study of the individual mind, sociology, the study of the group and collective mind. You'll remember the last of our big five, theodicy. Why must there be pain and suffering in this world? And how do you deal with that pain and suffering? We're going to be back to it again. Let's enjoy the reading of now this poem. I tried to think a lonelier thing than any I had seen. Some polar expiation, an omen in the bone of death's tremendous nearness. I probed retrieveless things, my duplicate to borrow. A haggard comfort springs from the belief that somewhere within the clutch of thought there dwells one other creature of heavenly love for God. I plucked at our petition as one should pry the walls between himself and horror's twin within opposing selves. I almost strove to clasp his hand, such luxury it grew, that as myself would pity him, perhaps he pitied me. Now, who is this Emily suffering twin? And the other? And this lonely idea, right? This idea of, notice thing is capitalized. I try to think a lonelier thing. Now, I would recommend that you circle the word think and then draw a little arrow from it and write the word create. Because if you do that, that will help you read this poem. I tried to create a lonelier thing. Now, this lonelier thing will become her horror's twin. In other words, there's another side. Emily's in converse with herself. We called our series Chats with Emily for a number of reasons. One of them is Emily is constantly engaged in some kind of conversation with herself, maybe we could say her other. I tried to think a lonelier thing than any I had seen. In other words, another reading of this is, I tried to come up with any person that could be more lonely than me, right? Some shall say it, polar expiation. Notice the referencing to the cold. An omen in the bone of death's tremendous nearness, to remind me, if you will, that soon I must die. I probe. Notice we go from tried to probed. You see this? Retrieveless things. So notice we go from thing capitalized to things. My duplicate. Now are we back to that Tim of poem 196? It's possible. Go back and look at our study of 196 to see that. My duplicate, to borrow a haggard comfort, springs from the belief that somewhere within the clutch of thought, notice think, thought, there dwells one other creature of heavenly love forgot. I mean, think of it. You're out in the outlands, the Badlands, all alone at night at 3 in the morning. Let's not ask why you're there alone. And your vehicle breaks down. What's the first thing you do? Your truck breaks down. What's the first thing you do? This is just great. My mom's going to kill. Whoa, whoa, whoa. You're talking? Who are you talking to? There is nobody there. And if somebody stepped out from behind sagebrush and said, who are you talking to? There's nobody there. Other than scaring you, you'd go, oh yeah, there is nobody there. So who am I talking to? See, we've all had this experience where I'm doing the talking and I'm doing the listening. Whoa. In other words, who is this person that I keep talking to in my thinking, that I keep playing with? And she says, I built somebody. I contrived for somebody to be my duplicate. Now what's ironic is that here in a little bit we're going to find out this duplicate of Emily's is male, not female, male. Now, of course, Emily's played the game a number of times in her poetry of imagining herself as something other than a woman, even a boy, and so maybe that's the game she's playing here. She says, my duplicate, to borrow, I was hoping for a haggard comfort, right? From the belief that somewhere within the clutch of thought, there dwells one other creature of heavenly love forgot. Now, some have referenced this as the idea that God is dead, the great Nietzsche idea. In other words, I looked for comfort from deity and I couldn't find it. That's how some have read this. But then there's this partition, which again takes us back to 449, right? There's this partition. I plucked at our partition as one should pry the walls. In other words, and of course, hello, Gilman's yellow wallpaper has to come to mind here. For those of you who have done that study, we've given full lectures at learnstrong.net. Of course, that woman losing her mind, right? Picking paper off of a wall to try and somehow experience who's on the other side. It's amazing how these two go together. A lot of debate about whether Gilman knew much of Emily's stuff. I plucked at our partition as one should pry the walls between himself. And there it is. And here's the thing. Even in a complicated poem like this, Emily captures what it means to be human. What is it to be human? We're always fighting against ourselves. Have you noticed this? We're always asking questions of ourselves. We're always taking an alternate position. Should I do this? Should I not do this? Of course, think about Shakespeare's Hamlet and the to be or not to be lines. We even reference those in the poem about a phantasm in the previous poem of 531. Here it's a different kind of phantasm. Notice, as I tried to get to my horror's twin, between himself and horror's twin, within opposing selves. And again, we're back to that idea of 449. In other words, I tried to somehow contact this duplicate of myself, this other voice of myself. And I almost, and I would circle the word almost, because to me that's the key word of the poem. I almost strove to clasp his hand. Now, I can't think of this line without thinking about Milton's Paradise Lost. And you'll remember at the conclusion, as Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden, what is it that we're told they do as they leave to go out into the new world, the scary new world? Right, holding hands. So she says, I almost got to where I could grab his hands. Such luxury, right? It would be so great if I could find somebody that I could at least associate with, hold on to their hand. It grew that as myself, could pity him. Perhaps he pitied me. Now, again, the brilliance of the way she sees this. By the way, you'll remember we've commented on it even in our last offering. She loves this word perhaps. Poem 696, she calls it acres of perhaps. If there's one line that references Emily, it's often that line, in my estimation, because Emily's always playing the game of perhaps. In other words, uncertainty, but embracing the ambiguity. And she wonders, I wonder if I could find my duplicate, would I pity him or would he pity me? As he looks at my life and goes, well, that's pretty pathetic. As opposed to me looking at his life and saying, well, you're pathetic. By the way, we're going to see this inner duality played again and again. I already mentioned 1323, 642, and 670. When we get to poem 561, we're going to play a similar game here in just a little bit. I measure every grief I meet with narrow, probing eyes. I wonder if it weighs like mine or has an easier size. I wonder if they bore it long or did it just begin. I could not tell the date of mine. It feels so old a pain. I wonder if it hurts to live. And if they have to try, and whether could they choose between it would not be to die. I know that some, gone patient long, at length renew their smile, an imitation of a light that has so little oil. I wonder if when years have piled some thousands on the harm that hurt them early, such a lapse could give them any balm. Or would they go on aching still through centuries of nerve, enlightened to a larger pain in contrast with the love? The grieved are many, I am told. There is the various cause. Death is but one and comes but once and only nails the eyes. There's grief of want and grief of cold, a sort they call despair. There's banishment from native eyes and sight of native air. And though I may not guess the kind correctly, yet to me, a piercing comfort it affords in passing Calvary. To note the fashions of the cross and how they're mostly one, still fascinated to presume that some are like my own. And then finally, when we get to poem 822, she'll play a similar game as well. This consciousness that is aware of neighbors and the sun will be the one aware of death, and that itself alone is transversing the interval experience between the most profound experiment appointed unto men, how adequate unto itself its property shall be, itself unto itself, and none shall make discovery. Adventure most unto itself, the soul condemned to be attended by a single hound, its own identity. All right, what is she saying here? I think her argument is that sometimes the best way to transcend suffering is to go deeper into it and try and live alongside of it. We don't know what has caused the suffering of this poem, and that might help us. At 3a, well, again, those poems of inner duality, as we've already read them, and of course 822 and 561. And again, Conrad's Heart of Darkness comes to mind. We quoted it in our study of the last poem. We live as we dream. Alone comes to mind here. Are we alone, though? Because to speak it out loud seems like you're listening to yourself. Who's doing the listening to the speaking? Finally, at 3b, when was a time that you met your twin, your duplicate? And to what degree were you comfortable with that? Or was it a horror? Thank you.